say, overvaluing transformation is another trick of narcissists and psychopaths and Machiavellians to gain the upper hand. But that's highly probable. You know, I've seen, for example, I've had a lot of demonstrations levied against me, a lot. And some of them were very intense and unpleasant, like very intense and intense and unpleasant. And they were mounted against me by people of the left, although that happens on the right as well, and it's happened to people I know by radical right-wingers. It's very interesting for me as a clinician to observe the people who are fomenting the protests. In my case, a lot of them were female, about 60%, probably 70%. And a lot of them were left-wing activist types, university students. And so, but intermingled with those women were a handful of men. And in Toronto in particular, and in Ontario, I encountered a lot of protests. And at a number of the protests, the same men showed up. And as a clinician, I could just spot who those people were immediately. Like one of them, for example, stood with a girl about 2 feet behind me at, I think it was University of Western Ontario. It's one of the worst protests that I was in. And they had an air horn. And air horns are plenty loud enough to damage your hearing. And they were blowing that air horn right on the edge of where it was damaging to me. And I looked at the girl, well, I thought, yeah, well, I don't know what you're up to, but I could tell what sort of person he was. He was there to upset things so he could prey on the women in the crowd who were the protesters. So he would come and advance himself as, well, I'm on your side, I'm one of you. And it's like he was 100% a predator. And I saw him and his ilk at all sorts of different demonstrations. And so he's the sort of person, if he sows chaos, it gives him opportunities that he wouldn't otherwise have because he had no competence in any real sense. Those sorts of men are so appalling that you can hardly even imagine what they're like unless you're very unlucky and have had the opportunity to get to know someone like that. So that notion that chaos can be sowed so the narcissists and the Machiavellians can flourish, that's a very interesting idea and highly probable. You certainly see it on the protest front. So back to your son. People were questioning the ethics of your decision to continue with his life, essentially, and also questioning you about the blindness that you had that in some sense enabled that. And then you said that gave you an insight into something that was deeply anti-human going on underneath the surface.
Exactly. And so I like reading. And so I read the biography of Keynes. And the biography of Keynes is all about Keynes as the economist. There are some segues into his politics. He was liberal or Labour. Certainly of the left.
Can you fill people in a little bit? Tell us a little bit about Keynes and the figure and the Keynes, position he occupies now among economists.
Keynes is the cornerstone of the Western economic thinking infrastructure in a way, because GDP is essentially the way that we calculate our wealth across the world. Is an equation that he came up with.
So he set the metrics.
Yeah, he was extremely influential. What was interesting about Keynes is that he is the one that negotiated the reparations that Germany had to pay with the French after the First World War. So he was a very, very influential character already. In the 30s and 40s, he obviously was an asset manager, but he was also very involved in politics and in the field of think tankery. In other words, he was very close to Mosley, interestingly enough, which he was our fascist leader, and Mosley had been...
In the UK, the fascist leader in the UK, right.
And he had been, unsurprisingly, a very prominent Labour MP. And he was also very interested in sociology. So he was part of the Bloomsbury group that was very close to the Fabian group, and the Fabian group became the Labour research group.
And this is Keynes specific, not Mosley. Keynes.
I'm just explaining the kind of groups that you had. Keynes was part of the Bloomsbury group, but it was very close intellectually to characters like Sidney Webb Beatrice Webb, Bernard Shaw, and all these people who were extremely influential. In fact, the LSE is a product of
the London School of Economics.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you read the book, it's nicely written and obviously a substantial amount of research. But the thing that completely goes by the wayside is the most important part of what Keynes himself believed about society. And you can only see it in an asterisk. There's a little asterisk. And as I said, you read the sentence and it says, John had to go to this place. And the slight description below is he went to speak to the Eugenics Society. And of course
that's a Freudian slip.
Exactly. And so again, it's the glitch in the machine, because you're going, hang on, it's 1943. We have a war going on with somebody who's very, very for eugenics. We are at war. We're sacrificing the entire British Empire to defeat that man. And that man's cornerstone ideology is eugenics. What is somebody as substantial as John Maynard Keynes doing at a eugenics dinner? And it turns out that he was the president of the British Eugenics Society from 1937 to 1944. And his last speech at the Galton Institute, Galton being the cousin of Darwin, importantly, Galton was a very, very prominent eugenicist. At that speech, he stood up and he said the most important field of social endeavor is eugenics. And so
we should do a sidebar quickly so that everybody understands what the field of eugenics proposes. And the idea is it's an offshoot of a pathological streak of Darwinism that claims that it stems in some sense out of the claim that the fittest survives. But then there's a twist on that to imply that the fittest are therefore morally and physically superior in some moral sense, and then which is not an implication, by the way, of standard modern biological evolutionary theory. And then more that you can identify those who are fit, let's say, by looking at those who are currently successful in society, and you can infer their moral and physiological superiority, and then you can rank order people by that superiority, and you could improve the race by not allowing those who were substandard, let's say, to use the Nazi terminology, to multiply. And that's technically wrong from the perspective of evolutionary biology, because it's a tenet of modern evolutionary biology that you cannot select for fitness. So you can select for a given attribute, and you can presume that that attribute is associated with fitness, but there's no justification whatsoever for that claim, because what constitutes fitness in some real sense varies unpredictably as the underlying landscape transforms. And so there's no basis for eugenics claims in the tenets of modern evolutionary biology. But that didn't stop hypothetically biologically oriented thinkers who were saying follow the science to lay forth a eugenics movement that did capture much of the left wing and the right wing in very many ways, from about 1890 to about till 1945.
Well, no, actually, I'd go much further than that. Eugenics is now the core of our modern societies. I think eugenics has seeped through. Don't forget that Keynes was one of the drivers of the formation of the United Nations and giving the pound sterling's supremacy to the American by allowing the dollar to be the only currency pegged to gold. All the other currencies in the world would have to translate or exchange their currencies into dollars, and then from dollar to gold. And that's a really important point. So in other words, he was already going for this idea of one global government. And there are some really interesting books that you can read. I'll send them to you because they're so interesting. One of them is Fabianism and the Empire. And in there, the pamphlet states very clearly, we start with National Socialism we will then go to international socialism. So this idea that you consolidate socialism at home nationally, and that's important because the National Socialists and the International Socialists, the communists, are essentially not on different sides of the equation. It's just a progression. One is national, and then it goes into the international space.
It's a progression towards radical centralization.
Exactly, and
predicated on the idea of implicit superiority.
Exactly, and but it's always done with the imposition. Force is always needed, and you can see that. You can read that
everything's power. You know. So.
Well, that's right. And if you read Mein Kampf, for instance, what happens is that Adolf is very, very clear about his views. You use power to impose, and you don't dwell too much in the detail. That's what he says in his book. He says, I don't want to be criticized because of my policies. I just want you guys to understand the broad picture.
Right.
So in other words, it's a replication.
Well, and Hitler definitely led by inference, because if you look at his statements, the statements of the sort that you described, he would lay out a low-resolution vision and insist in some sense that other people fill in, let's call them the gory details.
Yeah. No, exactly. And so the idea, when you start to think about what it implies, that booklet is so interesting because they talk about the idea of free trade as being an imposition on less cultured nations. And that book says that China will have to, we will have to impose free trade on the Chinese. It's 1902 at the time, because these people, because their culture hasn't moved on, and therefore, because it hasn't moved on, it's subject to, Darwinian
eradication.
Yeah, exactly. And so you've got so the reason why that's so important is because if you then bring it to the United Nations and what Keynes's view of the world was, you can see.
There's a strange implication in that phrase, survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
Because in some sense, and this is the case scientifically, the Darwinian proposition is a tautology, because it really means those who survive, survive.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean those who survive are most fit, except if you gerrymander the meaning of the term fit.
And you don't know what it means, right?
Well, it changes too.
Yeah.
So the way mosquitoes solve that problem is each mosquito, there's not a lot of variability in mosquito behavior as a consequence of socialization. So mosquitoes have a lot of offspring, maybe who knows how many tens of thousands of potential offspring per mosquito. And there's some biological variability across the set of offspring, and almost all of them are eradicated before they reproduce. Otherwise, we'd be knee-deep in mosquitoes in no time. But you can't predict a priori which of the variants that are produced by a given mosquito pairing are going to survive. You can't predict that without running the process. Yeah. And so you cannot define what's fit before it manifests itself.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, the notion of fitness it's a bad verbal choice, because it implies something like moral superiority, or superiority even on biological grounds, and there's no evidence for a kind of ethical or value-laden superiority.
Yeah, but so what's interesting about that, if we start to go deeply into this, is the fact that once you start to repeat that slogan, the survival of the fittest, all sorts of politics,
right,
all sorts of things become doable. The one thing that is removed is the emotional aspect of humanity, because you can be cast aside. Because if you don't survive, as you said, it's because you're not fit. Mm-hmm. And so,
and if you're not fit to survive, perhaps you shouldn't be allowed.
Exactly, and that's what this is what happens when you start looking into the think tanks of the Fabian Society from 1884 to just after.
Mm-hmm. And they were precursors to the modern socialists. The
exactly,
Fabians.
No,
and with the English twist, they weren't Marxist socialists precisely. They were their own brand.
Exactly, but the template is the same. So Mussolini was good friends with Lenin. It's really important to realize that he was the head of the Italian Socialist Party, and then he became a fascist because he was of the opinion, as was Lenin, that you could use power and force to take the reins of government,
right. Catalyze the revolution.
Exactly, and so, but Mussolini himself says it as well: take nationalism first, and then international socialism. That's the way we're going to do it. And so, this idea of using regulation and global laws in order to impose on weaker states is completely, you can see it now. The template was set, and it's been a process of establishing through the offices of these international institutions a world which would be governed centrally through the offices of the United Nations or the World Health Organization, all these bodies that strip you or me and anybody in this room of any actual rights. And you could see it in places like Austria, where the vaccine mandate was imposed, and suddenly the state tells you it is unconstitutional, but we'll do it anyway. And the reason why is because there's a scientific body of opinion that says that you ought to have drugs in your veins.
And a scientific body of opinion never says you ought.
Yeah.
As soon as someone says that the science says you ought, they've made the gap, they've made the leap from is to ought. And science concentrates on is, not on ought. And so the idea that you can somehow blindly follow the science, and also that you're moral by doing so, is about the most anti-scientific proposition that there could be. You know, and that the COVID mandates as well in Canada have precipitated what I think will be a constitutional crisis there too.
Yeah.
Because Trudeau is being taken to court right now on the grounds that his travel ban, which had no scientific justification whatsoever, even by the admission of the health personnel in Canada, that he attempted to compel to produce a post hoc scientific justification, found that the grounds for his actions were so threadbare and directed towards ensuring his hypothetical electoral victory in the last election, that they couldn't even fake a scientific rationale post hoc when they were demanded to by their bosses. So, but Canada's in such rough shape conceptually at the moment that a scandal of that nature, I think a scandal of that nature is so preposterous to Canadians that they can't even apprehend it.
But I think what's really difficult is that these scandals are coming thick and fast. Nothing changes. So the one constant that we were talking about, which has changed, the one thing that is not changing is the fact that these characters who are intellectually bankrupt are brazening it out.
Yeah, well, this winter might change all that. As soon as energy costs hit mortgage rate levels in the UK, then that game is going to be up. Because it just won't be sustainable.
But that's true, and that's why the interesting thing is that, I mean, we probably shouldn't spend too much time on the political landscape in the UK because it's complex and it's probably not that interesting in the long term. But what's interesting here is that some big things are happening which prove to us, to the observers, that the current leadership and thought, the current leadership structure and the current thought process has led to complete. Has led us, or has been led by people who are constantly wrong. They're wrong about everything they do. They're wrong in everything that they say. For the
they're
reason
wrong
for
in
this,
their vision. They're wrong in their strategy. They're wrong in their use of power.
In particular, because what we've seen in Europe over the last, let's say, 200 years, is a desire through the Fabians. It's interesting. I will send you that book. It's very important. But
Fabianism in the Empire.
What you see is people despising people who work for money.
Yeah, right.
Right. People, the markets are dead.
Yeah, that's like the Dutch not paying attention to the farmers, or the Trudeau government demonizing the truckers.
But it's deeply set. I mean, this and the reason why the Fabians decided to permeate the institutions, that's the terminology that you should perhaps keep in mind when you read these books, the permeation of institutions.
So that's where the Long March for the institutions came from.
That's the idea. That's where that's the development. So it's really, it's a very interesting, a bit dry, but it's an interesting book. And then suddenly what you see is that they notice very quickly in the early 1880s that the working man doesn't vote for them or for their policies. Right. And they're really upset that they really like this chap called Disraeli, because Disraeli was a very erudite, smart, funny kind of statesman.
And the working class is intractable in its refusal to see its own best interests.
Exactly. So that's part of the process. So they decided we cannot win, but what we can do is become experts, and through our expertise, we go through the channels and we enable politicians to implement our policies, because we will advise them on the solutions. And
that's detailed out in
it's in a book. And so once you start to look at these things, you realize that the enemy of these people is the person that says no to them. So you need force. You need there is no consensus to be had, and therefore what we were talking about, which is this this relationship between you and me, this reciprocity, this is a sign of respect. It's argument
and sustainability.
Absolutely. So if we are, lots can change, technology can change, but if we as human beings choose to accept that we are the same in terms of value before God, if we choose to accept that for my actions, there are certain things that they will have an impact on you and vice versa, then we create a society that actually is quite stable and worth living in. If the moment you accept the Fabian premise that there is a small group of people who are right and therefore the others are wrong, that's when you start to create a society.
And that's justified by reference to expertise.
Exactly. And so there is a great quote in the book where one of the Fabians says, our aim is to make sure that when the people come to the barricades, to make all the constitutional changes so that the moment they come to the barricades, we will be able to crush them. In other words, you use the Constitution and the law, you change them through the experts, and you strip the masses, as it were, of their frightening power. Once they get to the barricade, it's too late. That was the idea that they were developing, and so all of that becomes, I think, with hindsight, that's the reason why we live in this era of revelation, in my view. So much, if we choose to see these discussions and where these ideas come from, and really just try to map them on today's world, we see lots and lots of strands that lead from the 1880s to 2022.
Do you have any sense? You talked to me before we started the podcast about the entanglement of Keynes' ideas with those of Marx and Darwin and Malthus. Yeah. And you talked about this profound anti-humanism that you saw manifested, say, in relationship to your personal life because of the existence of your son. Now, and we talked about, we took a pathway through the notion that top-down force is justified by the existence of a privileged and fit elite, with the rest of the people, let's say, being in some real sense necessarily expendable. So I would like to know how you think that the Marxist ideas, is the connection with Marxism the notion that the masses need to be transformed in their conscious apprehension by the elites? Is that the fundamental point of contact?
So in the Communist Manifesto, both, by the way, Mein Kampf and the Communist Manifesto say the same thing. One of them is, we will lead the revolution. There will be a small group of believers who will lead this world or these people to the promised land. So it's, again, the experts. It's the reason why Marx is part of the picture, in my view, or the kind of the ring, as it were, is because he sees humanity through the lens of something that actually doesn't exist, which is class. I don't think that people see themselves as part of a class. They might have said it, they might say it in their speech because it's a shorthand for somebody who's here, somebody who's there. But actually, conceptually, there is no such thing as a defined class. And you can see it in elections. I mean, lots of politicians make mistakes, and the mistake they make is that they assign somebody's views about something on their political on their supposed social.
So they presuppose a class consciousness.
And this presupposition leads them to making the wrong decisions or to be taken by surprise, because the assumptions they made are not based on anything observable, but they're based on their own delusions.
You could see that in the U.S. with the Democrats, surprised that the working class is no longer on the side of the Democrats.
And of course, they're to blame. because
Right. Yeah, well, you see this in Canada too.
But
if the populace was just as enlightened as the leaders who were working on their behalf, they'd obviously be supportive, let's say, of Trudeau's radically socialist policies.
Yeah.
They're not enlightened enough for that.
Well, no, of course, because they've got real jobs, and real jobs, as we know, are dirty.
I worked in a restaurant when I was a kid that was run by a couple of small businessmen. Guy who I worked directly for was named Scotty Kyle, and Scotty was a rough guy. He was about 32 or 33. I was about 14, and he'd had most of his teeth knocked out in fights, and he'd been an alcoholic for years. He quit drinking about 5 years before I knew him. Unbelievably funny person and very, very bright. And I was working for the socialists in my town at that point when I was 14, and they had a pretty good small business policy. At that point in my province, Alberta, there was one socialist and like 200 conservatives. That was it. And the socialist was an old labor leader, and he was actually a pretty good guy. In any case, and people voted for him in this small town, not because he was a socialist, but because he was a good guy. In any case, the socialists, the New Democratic Party, had a pretty good small business policy. And so, but the guy I worked for and the owner of the restaurant, who was also a working class guy, they didn't have anything to do with the socialists. And I asked Scotty one day, I said, why in the world don't you and Ken support the NDP? They have a way better small business policy, and you're a small business. He said, yeah, but we don't want to be a small business. He said, people vote their dreams, not their reality.
Yeah.
I thought that was so bloody smart, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the issue that's problematic with regard to class consciousness, is because a lot of people who are in the lower strata, let's say, of the socioeconomic hierarchy, don't identify, to use that horrible word, with that strata. They have aspirations, and if not for themselves, for their children. And they would like to set up a world where the successful can thrive, partly because they would like their children to be successful. And then, so that's a great reason. I never forgot that. And then, about the same time, I'd been reading George Orwell, and Orwell talked about the Fabian types a lot, even though Orwell had some socialist sympathies, being, what would you say, an avatar for the working class.
The road to Whig and Pitt.
Yes.
A must read.
He said in that, he said that he couldn't understand the middle class, you know, shoulder or elbow patch wearing socialist who identified with the working class but was certainly not part of it. His observation was, part of the reason that socialism failed to grip the working class is because those socialists didn't love the poor, they just hated the rich.
Yeah.
And I also think the working class has a real instinct for that. Working class
but that's, you know,
has an instinct for that and distrusts that sentiment of envy, you know, masquerading as compassion for the poor.
No, but that's a really interesting one. So the interesting thing about the dislike of the rich is, of course, they are themselves rich. And there's a great description in the book when they start off, or the Fabian Society first meets, about 15 or 20 people. And the guy just notes that there's only one guy who could feasibly call himself working class.
Right.
And I always thought it was a guy called Stan who went there by mistake. And just turned out it was a pastor, and he thought, maybe there's some clients for me later.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, the one thing they despised in particular was the landowning class. And so what I think they were trying to do is to find a way to become the new aristocracy with the same privileges, and to find ways to be permanently funded. And that required the ability to find pockets of capital. And what's the best place to seek permanent funding? Well, that's the government. And so the interesting thing is that they did everything they possibly could to and you'll see in the writing, the aristocracy was part of where they came from very often, but they wanted to be able to be in a position where they couldn't be removed from earning good money, and at the same time they also wouldn't have the ties to the working population that you need when you're a landowner. Because, of course, when you're a landowner, you work in agriculture, you work with people who are dirty. You've got dirty fingernails and all sorts of things like that. So what
because they're in touch with reality.
Exactly. And so what's interesting about the vocabulary used by the Fabians is extermination. It's everything that has to do with commerce is evil and bad and dirty and everything else. And you can see the language already being extremely
That's
violent.
disgust language, not fear language.
Yeah.
So if you read, I read a book called Hitler's Table Talk, and I had learned at that point that there was a large connection between certain forms of extreme political views and the emotion of disgust rather than fear. And the Table Talk is a collection of Hitler's spontaneous utterances at mealtimes collected over about 4 years. And all of the references to the people that he wanted to exterminate are disgust language, not fear.
But that's what George Orwell talks about. He says, it's the smell. They smell bad.
Right.
And as a result,
which is very visceral emotion.
It's the worst. It's the worst that you can possibly say.
Right.
That's what he describes. But yes, so Marx fits into this because, like all of these guys, you're atomizing humanity in artificial what's the word?
Categories.
Categories. And I think that's what we are witnessing.
And then you put Malthus in there. That lays in very nicely.
Malthus was the reason why Malthus makes sense is because he's the first one that starts to go for economic reasons. In other words, for an abstraction. Perhaps we should have fewer human beings.
Right.
But too many of us. And then the concept of a life worth living. In other words, if you're poor, quite clearly, your life is not going to be fun, right? So in other words, rather than say that humanity is sacred and the person who is born ought to be able to live until his dying day, and it might be tough, but actually, if he is, the more of us there are, the stronger, more powerful we are, the more solutions we can create, the more brains there are, the more dynamic things become. He was one of the first ones who just said, well, let them die.
Or that will inevitably occur as population exceeds its capacity to produce.
And he was proven wrong all the time.
Right, continually.
He's being continually wrong, and yet.
Well, the way the Malthusian biologists deal with that is they say, well, you just got the time frame wrong.
Exactly.
And they can keep doing that.
So that's 200 years of being wrong. And so,
well, no, it'll take 500 years, but eventually it'll happen.
But this notion then that we hear more and more often is that the world is overpopulated. Okay. So what does that mean?
The planet has too many people on it.
So the corollary there is there are too many people, and what does that mean? Well, we need to have fewer, and how do you have fewer?
Well, we're working hard on that right now.
Exactly. We'll create a humane policy. It's a little bit like One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, where you take out where you just where you just take out the brains and you just dismantle the guy because he's refusing to accept what you're saying. But
I just did a criticism. I wrote it for the Telegraph of a Deloitte memo that was published in May.
And I read it.
Deloitte, you read that? The Deloitte consultants claimed, well, we're in an ecological crisis, and of course that's of indeterminate magnitude, but it's an emergency crisis, and it's such an emergency that no measures are too much. And if we don't take the measures, things are going to be much worse at some unspecified time in the future, according to our models. And so the solution to that right now is to get everyone to tighten their belts. Not us, of course, because we have ample girth. But all those, without any apprehension or with complete blindness to the fact that if you take an economic hierarchy, there's always people at the bottom that are barely holding on.
The poor will always be with us.
Yes, exactly. And there's, let's say, several billion of them in the world right now. And then if you add what to the top echelons is a 5% burden, let's say, you take out huge swaths of the people who are at the bottom. But if the notion is, well, we have to do that because the utopia won't arrive if we don't, and things will be worse, then of course you can justify that continually. And if it's also driven by the ethos that, well, if those people were as good in some intrinsic sense as we were, then they wouldn't be in the position where they would be dying as a consequence of our necessary actions. And I see all of that lurking behind the fact that in the UK right now, your energy prices have already, doubled, tripled?
Well, they're insane,
Yeah, and they're nowhere near as insane as they're going to get. And so, well, you should just tighten your belt. You don't need to drive. You don't need to heat your house. Switzerland, turn your thermostat beyond 19 degrees, 3 years in jail.
It's going to be to be a very cold winter.
Yes, it certainly is. Cold, dark, and hungry.
And so Malthus is essentially saying there's a price to living. So there's the human being can be discarded. It's the concept of overpopulation becomes an academic topic and that's taken seriously, so it becomes ingrained.
Right, and then it's a moral necessity to bring depopulation about.
Exactly, and so we're hearing people in positions of of power talking about the fact that we need to retreat back to a world where we had 500 million people.
I know.
That's 7.5 billion people that you're trying to get rid of. That's
they're trying to beat the communist record for extermination.
It's insane, and yet these people have. And I think the reason why I think so let me just go through.
Do you have any idea who came up with the 500 million figure?
I forgot her name, but it was during a WEF.
There's a shock.
Yeah, so
they just threw that number out. Well, we think it's about 500 million. But might be a billion, but it's only 500 million difference.
It's always people like them that will survive, of course. I mean, that's
that's what people think.
Yeah, of course. But as we say, the thing that we know is that they're always wrong. And the reason why they're always wrong is because the premise of the argument is not based on observations. It's based on wishful thinking. And so
self-serving, narcissistic, wishful thinking that comes along with the privilege that's always what criticized. It's really quite something.
Yeah. So Malthus is very important. Malthus is important because he says too many human beings. Keynes is important because he's the leading member of the British Eugenics Society. Then Marx is important because he, just like Keynes and Malthus, says that that people belong in boxes. In other words, they're not humans. They are what we say they are, not what they want, what the human being himself thinks he is.
That's biological essentialism, right? Or religion, the opiate of the masses.
Exactly. And then you've got Darwin that comes in. Darwin writes in particular about race, and there are some very interesting quotes with him and parliamentarians where he explains geopolitical changes, including with the Ottoman Empire, through the lens of race. And one of the last sentence of Dissent, his last book, is essentially, I would rather be a descendant from a monkey than a savage. And so the reason why these four people matter is because they are deeply rooted in our educational framework, whether it's in Canada, the US, France, Germany. These four characters represent biology, economics, politics, and sociology. And so for me, that's really important because that framework is essentially where most of our leaders have been have grown up intellectually, and so what's important about this is that we have to escape, in my view, or we have to try and at least become really aware of what these ideas were, in order for us to be able to extricate ourselves. And so this is the reason why I get very uncomfortable, and I have been. It's a bit like, again, that glitch. This sentence, extremes meet in the middle, for me is inelegant. And it's inelegant because extremes cannot meet in the middle. It's either science is right or politics is right. And if politics is driven by the leaders we have now, they're certainly not right. So extremes are what they are. In other words, extremely hot, extremely cold, extremely large, extremely small. They can never meet by definition.
So why is the issue of extreme and the middle relevant in the course of the conversation?
The reason why it's important is because we have to be able to understand the world around us. And we keep being shifted we keep talking about extreme right, extreme left, but actually we need to understand that there is no difference between one and the other. And that's the reason why this framework, intellectually, I think is a nice way of explaining it. It's this proclivity for centralization. Exactly.
The human beings, of an elite.
A small minority of people, human beings are, you can jettison them, they are irrelevant. Class matters, race matters, or your capabilities, all of this, your humanity is completely stripped. Right. So actually what we see when we think about this like a stadium or an arena is that Adolf is to Stalin like the bronze medalist is to the gold medalist. They are standing in the same arena, competing in the same sport, facing in the same way.
I see what you mean.
And so what they have is that they are all the recipients, whether it's Mussolini, Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, and all these guys, have all the same ideas. So it's that field that is so important, in my view. And what is the extreme opposite of these views?
Yeah.
Right.
That is a question.
It's love your neighbor
Yeah,
as you love yourself.
I've thought about it as the spirit of playful reciprocity.
Yeah. It's
the opposite of power.
Exactly. It's love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yeah.
It's we are made in the image of God.
Yeah.
Reciprocity. This is what we've been talking
And
about.
consent
Actually,
and voluntary association.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there is an extreme, but the extreme is not either left or right. We have to. So if what I'm saying makes sense, it's a bit long-winded, I know, but it's because sometimes we have to unpack certain ideas and everything else. I think the important thing there is to realize that whether the totalitarians themselves all operate under the same presumptions, that's what we're facing. And technology gives them a power they didn't have before. But there is hope, as there always is. The hope is that we rediscover our humanity. And there is a body of texts that says just that.
Yeah.
It's just that we need to rediscover it. And we need to be very clear about the roots of these ideologies.
Well, I've been talking today to Mr. Ellick's story about, his personal experiences on the familial front and the rabbit hole, let's say, that led him down morally in relationship to his wife and also intellectually. And we've attempted, as a consequence of this conversation, to draw parallels, both biographical and conceptual, between what he stumbled across or what was placed in front of him in the, what would you say, in the form of a challenge and responsibility that he accepted, and some visions he had about the part of the underlying spirit, pathological spirit of the totalitarian impulses of the present age. And so thank you very much for speaking with me, and also for providing these readings. I will make a list of the books that we discussed, Fabianism in the Empire and Darwin's Descent, as well as John Maynard Keynes' biography. I'll put those in the links. And thank you to all who were watching and listening.
Sidelsky is the author. Lord Sidelsky.
Of the Keynes.
Yeah.
And Sidelsky?
You're putting me on the spot.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Okay, that's fine. We'll put it in the link.